Tonight's presentation is Lexicon, bite-sized intros to different languages. This event is meant to bring you the basics of a new language as well as some basics of the culture and history. And tonight's language is Hebrew, brought to us by Rabbi Jonathan Rudnick. Rabbi Rednick devotes himself to community care using his vast knowledge. With a BA degree from Claremont McKenna College, a diploma of International Comparative Law of Human Rights from University of Strasbourg, a master's degree in International Affairs from Columbia University, a Master of Arts degree in Jewish Communal Service from Brandeis University, a fellowship in Education and Policy at Mandel School for Educational Leadership, and a Master of Arts degree in Jewish Studies from the Schechter Institute of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem, where he was ordained. Rabbi Rednick, we're very happy to see you here, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Well, you're welcome, Michaela. Thanks for the introduction, which is very heavy on the academics. So just say what that makes me more than anything else is a lifelong learner and very aware of all that I haven't learned. And part of that is why I'm excited to spend time with you all this evening, sharing some of my passion for Hebrew. I would be what some people would call a Hebrew fanatic. And that really has to do with my perspective on how important Hebrew is, particularly in the putting together of the different pieces of the Jewish puzzle, you might say, which I'll say and I'll speak a little bit more about in a little bit, is not just limited to Jewish people, but it really is kind of the glue that holds the different pieces of the Jewish puzzle together as I see it and as I've experienced it. So let me first start out with a Hebrew word that you all know and wish everyone shalom. I'm kind of astounded, and I just saw Kirk kind of mouth shalom, and I don't know Kirk. Nice to meet you, Kirk. But it is my experience here in Kansas City, where I grew up, that people know shalom, and it's just really comfortable for them, which is kind of surprising to me in a way. So I just want to use this as an example because it's a good place to start. So a lot of people know that shalom means hi and bye and peace. But I want to focus on the peace aspect of it for a moment. And it actually, I mean, we could delve deeply just on this in terms of looking at conflict around the world, not to mention the Middle East, whether it directly affects or involves Israel or not. But that is by way of saying that the root of the word shalom, which is 3 Hebrew letters, sh, l, and m, those 3 sounds, right, means wholeness or whole, to be whole. So shalom comes to mean peace by way of wholeness, not by way of kind of the opposite of war. Right, so you know what ramifications that might have when we're looking at war and peace or conflict would be interesting lenses to look through. But when you say shalom, it's really wishing the other person that they would be whole in who they are and how they are. So it's quite an interpersonal, really, blessing or a recognition. In a deeper way than sometimes the word is kind of thrown out, shalom, shalom, shalom. But the deeper message is, you know, hoping that you're connected and are you connected to your wholeness. And by the way, that's how in Hebrew, that's how you ask someone how they're doing, is you ask, what is their shalom? Right? Ma is what in Hebrew? So ma ha-shalom shelcha, or ma ha-shalom shelach, to a woman. So I want to start with shalom. A little bit of background beyond the academics. So I had the privilege as I was growing up as a young adult in college to study abroad in Norway. And as I went to Norway, having been to Israel before and choosing a place that I could kind of start from zero in terms of not knowing anything about the culture, the language, and see what that was like to start to learn from there. During that semester at the University of Oslo, part of the program was a field trip to the capitals of Scandinavia, which included at that time Leningrad, which was part of the Soviet Union then. So kind of became connected also to Russian. And when I came back, I was very interested in the Jewish community, particularly in the former Soviet Union, or in the Soviet Union at that time, and Russian/Soviet culture, and started to study Russian here at Penn Valley Community College. And during that year, someone connected me to the International Relations Council. So I really feel like it's a reconnection tonight, which I'm pleased about. So I want to answer and relate first to some of the questions that Evan put out there, kind of as some kind of rubric, I guess you would say, or some basic things to go over for these lexicon of language sessions. But I also want to say that I'm going to stop periodically and just ask if people have questions or comments, things they want to put out there, so we can try to make this a bit interactive, even though I know I'm coming as a resource to try to share some different perspectives on Hebrew. So a little bit in terms of the geographic connection of Hebrew at this point in time as a modern language would be Israel, right? The kind of unique part of that, which is not only the case with Hebrew, but it is a language that is the modern day main language of functioning of a country called Israel. It is also a language that is taught throughout the world in Jewish communities, wherever they are, and has a lot to do with the connection between the Jewish diaspora, those Jewish people living outside of Israel, and those people living in Israel. We're talking about a language that is a little bit complicated in the sense that it is both a biblical language and a language that was used during the medieval period, let's say, for poetry, but not used to speak and to communicate among people in that way. And in a sense, with the modern state of Israel and leading up to, let's say, the 100 years prior to 1948, a lot of revival of the Hebrew language. Hebrew is the language that is written and read from right to left, which makes it somewhat unique and very different from English in that sense. And it is a Semitic language, which, among other things, means paradoxically that it has a very strong connection as a language with Arabic. Now, I say paradoxically because when you think about Arabs in Israel, most people think about conflict, right? And there is certainly that. There is also a lot of other story to tell about the connection between Arabs and Israel, Arabic and Israel. Arabic is also one of the official languages of Israel, along with English. So every major sign in Israel, like a traffic sign, for example, street sign would be in Arabic, English, and Hebrew. And for example, shalom, if you know the word in Arabic for shalom, right, for peace, would be salam. So you can already kind of feel the similarity linguistically, phonetically between shalom and salam. And a year ago, I was taking a road trip with my brother to Memphis, and we're in Memphis and kind of spending a couple days near this water in this cabin. And the only store was this mini market. And of course, lo and behold, in the middle of Memphis, with all my stereotypes of what the South is like, you have these Jordanians who are kind of an extended family who own this little mini market, and fascinating, really wonderful, warm people. And one day we walked in after maybe the second or third day we were there, and there was a new man there. And he clearly saw that we had some familiarity with a couple of the other people we'd already met the day or two before. And he kind of was asking, well, who are you guys? And so forth. And I said, well, we're neighbors, you know. And then he gracefully reminded me, and he said, no, we're not neighbors, right? were cousins, right? So similar, and of course that has its roots in the biblical story, right, of Isaac and Ishmael. And so a lot of times cousins is a euphemism among Israelis for the other. Instead of saying that person's an Arab, say that person's a cousin, right? And I think it's really important because if anything might bring us closer to peace, it would be not any particular issue being solved, but a feeling that there is a special connection there. So as I said, Hebrew goes right to left. The Hebrew language has 22 letters, and 5 of those letters are particularly special in the sense that they have 2 forms of them. One form when they come at the beginning or throughout a word, except for the final letter, and one when they're used as a final letter. Right? So the m, the shalom, the m, the m sound at the end of shalom would be an example of that. That it looks different when it's in that m sound is in the middle of a word. When it comes at the end, like shalom, it looks differently. We also, in general, today, you kind of have 2 forms. You have block letters of Hebrew and script letters. So even though, just like in English, less and less people actually write in terms of penmanship. By the way, Mrs. Sells in 4th grade said my penmanship was terrible, and it continues to be equally terrible in English and Hebrew. But I like writing in Hebrew. And those letters look differently than printed letters. And in the Torah, when you open up the Torah, you have those block printed letters. Let me say something about, and this is a little technical, but I'm just going to take a minute to do it. So vowels in Hebrew, for the most part, are not letters the way they are in English. They are markings. Sometimes they're dots, sometimes they're lines. They can be above letters, or for the most part, they're below letters. And they would tell you whether that m sound goes ma, or may, or mu, or me, would be those markings. In the Torah, there aren't any of those markings. So that really kind of shows this very, very ancient oral tradition of people kind of knowing how to say these words, even though when you see them in the Torah, they're not vocalized. And there was another question here which I found interesting, especially because when I was studying Russian, there were 2 examples of this, one that was familiar to me from Hebrew and one that's unique to Russian, although maybe other languages that I don't know, which is the sound. So that may have sounded like static on your speakers, but I'm going to do it again to say. So for example, Hanukkah is not Hanukkah with an H, and it's also not Chanukah, even though it looks like it's Chanukah, because a lot of times in English, people use a CH to approximate that letter, which is a chet in Hebrew, but it's really Chanukah. And it's interesting to note that for that letter, a chet, or also another letter that kind of can sound like an A, but it's called an ayin, that the pronunciation, which is kind of guttural in the back of the throat, really depends a lot on where Jewish people were dispersed to. So Jews from Yemen really are probably the group of Jews that pronounce those letters in the most accurate, kind of genuine, original way. Whereas Jews in America kind of lose that guttural sound. So the influence of the different countries where Jews live comes to impact Hebrew as well. I'm just going to mention a couple other things about the language kind of in general. One is that Hebrew is a really succinct language. So you think about it, it's a language that for a long time was dormant in terms of verbal expression. So when the language started to be revived in a modern context, there were so many words that needed to be, I guess you would say, discovered or uncovered or recovered. And of course, the Bible is a big resource for looking for some of those words, but there are also things that weren't in the Bible too, and how are you going to say them, right? Like computer, right? For example, which is a word in Hebrew that is very familiar to everyone today in Israel, and the root of it is to think, right? But it's a new word that didn't exist before. So it's a relatively succinct language. So if you look at a paragraph of Hebrew and next to a paragraph of English translated the same content, the Hebrew would be considerably shorter than the English. There's also gender differences, right? So when you're saying you to a man or you to a woman in Hebrew, those yous are different, and you know who you're speaking to based on the form you're using. Whereas in English, it's just you, and just by the you, you don't know if the you you're talking to is really, in this case, singular or plural, or what gender that person is, masculine or feminine. So there's some nuance in terms of the gender in Hebrew. The order sometimes looks opposite as English. So for example, White House, Bait is the Hebrew word for house. The Hebrew word for white is Lavan. So White House, the color comes first, and then, or the adjective you might say, and then the noun. And in Hebrew, it's the other way around. It's Bait Lavan. You first kind of say what you're talking about, and then whatever you're going to say about that, in this case, noun that you're talking about. And I'm going to give two examples of words in English that we're very familiar with and think about as English words whose roots, one for sure is in Hebrew, and the other one I strongly suspect that it is. So first is the word maven, right? So when you think of a maven, right, a maven is really, you might say, an aficionado in terms of a synonym, but really what that person is someone who really understands well that topic. They're a baseball maven. They're a maven of this or a maven of that. And not surprisingly, mavin in Hebrew means to understand. So ani is I. So ani mavin is I understand. So that ends up being a pretty clear connection between the Hebrew for understand and the word in English maven. The other one is really fascinating because of the biblical story, and that is tour, T-O-U-R, like to take a tour or to tour this land or that land. And it comes from a story in the fourth book of the Torah, which is the book, I'm trying to remember what it's called in English, the book of Numbers, right? Or Bamidbar. I don't want to get too tangential, but it's all exciting to me. So by way of just opening up a quick window or parentheses to say that each of the 5 books of the Bible that many of you are familiar with, at least the names of them in English, the Hebrew names are very different than the English names. They're not translations other than the first book. And so they point to different emphases on what you're trying to point out about that book. So let me just close those parentheses, but say in that fourth book of the Torah, the book of Numbers, you have this story of the scouts who are sent into the land by Moses, one from each of the 12 tribes, and to kind of see what does this land look like before we go in there. And this is the land that God has promised the Jewish people, and it goes back to the beginning of the quote unquote Jewish story. I'll say something about that in a moment, with Abraham and Sarah and their family. This is the land. So these scouts get sent in to scout out the land. And the word to scout out is latur. And it's the only place in the Torah that that verb and that word is used. So it is a very unique and special word. When that happens in the Bible, in the Torah, when you have a word that's not used anywhere else, it becomes very unique in terms of figuring out why why is that used only in this particular instance? So whether it's the Ministry of Tourism in Israel, whose kind of emblem and symbol is a picture of two of those scouts bringing back I forget what it's called in English, but for lack of a better word, a bunch of grapes on this stick that they're both carrying. So tourism, tourist, to tour the land. All right, let me stop for a moment and see if anyone has any questions or comments before we kind of take this next step of the Hebrew journey together.
I have a question.
Please, I can't see you. I don't think I can see you, but let me see. Maybe I can. Okay, yes, I can. Is that Kurt?
Yeah, it's Kirk.
Yeah, please.
You know, English doesn't have any gatekeepers. You know, the French have an institute where they kind of will adopt words into the French language or reject them. In English, it's a free-for-all. Does Hebrew have an organization that kind of says this is official Hebrew and other things are not?
Yes, it does. It's a great question. And it is called, I didn't know that about France. It is called the Academy, right, for the Hebrew language, Academia Lelashon Ha'ivrit. And it is academics, linguists, historians, and by the way, some biblical scholars, because a lot of the work on the Hebrew language, when you're trying to introduce a new word, we're trying to kind of have some continuity with what was, whether there's anything close to that in any of the biblical literature in the Hebrew, or at least in the form. If we're going to introduce a new verb, that it should be put into a verb form that is familiar. So, you know, to text, for example, or this is probably passé, but SMS, right? So that became a verb, you know, to SMS in Hebrew, right? But yeah, it's interesting. So, you know, it sometimes they'll make the news debating or introducing a new word, as you say. And, you know, Israel, I don't know, it's up there, if not the per capita largest publisher of books. So Israelis read a lot. And when you go back in, you know, even 50 years before the founding of the country, right? And even really at the founding, there were huge culture wars, by the way, because no one could imagine, how could you have, first of all, Hebrew, it hasn't been used in all this time as a language to communicate among people, and it just wouldn't be ready for it. Like how could you have university classes being taught in Hebrew? I mean, when you fast forward to today, which hasn't been that long, it's astounding that where kind of the Hebrew language has come to. But back then, academics could not imagine any other language of instruction at universities in Israel other than German, because that was kind of the key, you know, academic scholarly language. So there were some real, you know, tensions around, is this possible? And that Hebrew literature would get to the point where it is, where there's so much of it, and so many Israelis are into it. I'll share with you a story I thought was not only interesting, but it was very appropriate confrontation. So when I was finishing graduate school and getting ready to move to Israel, I moved to Israel and lived there for 12 years before coming back here in 2006. When my dad was sick, and I was working as a chaplain, which is an interesting story in and of itself in terms of the Hebrew, because there was no word then in Hebrew for chaplain, right? The only chaplain that Israelis knew from American culture was Charlie Chaplin. So, you know, which elicits exactly the response that I hope everyone can see on Kirk's face in Matthew's, right? Which is actually better than the usual response when a chaplain walks into a room, which is kind of dread, like, oh, it must be bad if the chaplain's here, right? But even figuring out what do we call this person? What do we call, chaplaincy, pastoral care, and so forth. But anyhow, right before I moved, I was finishing my graduate studies, and we had this trip to Israel for 3 weeks. And one of the days we spent at Haifa University, and Haifa is one of the cities in Israel that's known as a mixed city, which means that not just there's a couple of Arabs in that city, or like in an Arab village, maybe a couple of Jews, but significant population of Jews and Arabs. And of course, but I don't want to take this in granted. I say, of course, but among the Arabs, right, there's typically a mix of Muslims and Christians, which also can be a different culture, although they're both speaking Arabic and come out of an Arab background. But in any case, there are a lot of Arab students at University of Haifa, and we had this meeting with a group of Arab students. And I remember it not only because this young woman who got up to speak was, I thought, wow, she is quite attractive. And she got up and she said, I think it's really interesting that here we are having this meeting between us, a group of students at Haifa University, and between you guys, a group of Jewish graduate students from America, and we have to have this meeting in English, not because we don't know Hebrew, because we know Hebrew fluently, and all our classes at the university are in Hebrew, but because you guys don't know your own language. So just take that in for a moment, because that felt like quite a powerful sock in the stomach, right? And very motivational, right? And so that gets also to a little bit of the dynamism in terms of, outside of Israel, we tend to think of Hebrew as a language that's very connected to Jewish people, right? Not that people from other faith traditions or from no faith tradition don't learn or study Hebrew, particularly if they want to study scripture, for example. That's one of the motivations for doing that. But it's really interesting because in Israel, because it is the dominant language, you have all these people who are not Jewish, who speak Hebrew, understand Hebrew, and who live largely in Hebrew, which is a really beautiful thing, but an experience that it's hard to imagine without being there. So, okay, let's take this journey. This journey I want to propose that we take for a few minutes now is through a Hebrew lens, starting with Hebrew, in terms of what Jews as a group are known as and how they're known through the unfolding of the Bible. So first, we're known as Hebrews, which, by the way, is why the language is called Hebrew. Okay, we're not Hebrews. A lot of Jewish people would say, oh, we're Hebrews because our language is Hebrew. But actually it's the other way around. Our language is Hebrew because we're Hebrews. So before we're known as Jews and before we're known as Israelites, according to the Torah, as that unfolds, we're known as Hebrews. And Hebrew literally means to cross over. And it has to do with this spiritual story of this journey of crossing over these rivers from the land of Ur, which is basically in the area of Iraq today, to go on this journey to quote the Torah, a land that I will show you, right? And ending up in a place that ends up being called the land of Israel. So we're known as Hebrew, and that's a really important part of our identity, especially when you think about all the moving around that Jewish people have done, for the most part, not by our own desire or decision, but it has kind of become part of the culture of being ready to move, which is very interesting, by the way, because some people look at America as being the exception to that. And of course, if you look at in the last year or two, or even if you go back to the shootings here in Kansas City 6 years ago, that raises some important questions about, is America so different? But before that, you know, some of the conversation sometime would be about America as the new promised land. Like, this is the place where there is no anti-Semitism, and we're not going to have to leave, and so forth. That these roots of you cross over because you're moving from this place to that place, there's a lot of that. And that expresses itself linguistically in terms of different words from languages where Jews have lived that have made their way into Hebrew. Not surprisingly, Arabic, but for example, Persian words, Greek words. So for some people who are familiar with the history, that's not surprising, but it is interesting that Hebrew as a Jewish language becomes this vessel that holds these aspects of other languages where Jews were living and brought with them to the land of Israel and to the Hebrew language. The next thing we get known as is Israelites. And that is a really, really important story. I would say the Hebrew story is a really important people story, as in terms of the collective, the group of people. The Israelites is a really interesting individual story because it goes back to Jacob and an all-night wrestling match that happens, relatively speaking, in the beginning of the Bible, in the first book of the Torah, in Genesis. And without going too much into that story, it's really worth checking out, not so much necessarily as a religious thing, but it's really interesting to get at this dynamics, which psychotherapy and psychoanalysis has made a lot of meaning out of what happened that night. Because the upshot of that night is that when Jacob and this other wrestler disengage, Jacob is blessed, and he's blessed by being given a new name. So by this other wrestler who says, your blessing is you'll no longer be known as Jacob, but you'll be known as Israel, Yisrael. And if you look at the word in Hebrew, Yisrael, it's kind of this wordplay and, pardon me, amalgamation of the English would be because you have wrestled, you have grappled, you have striven with beings, divine and human, and you have, oftentimes it's translated as you have become more, or you have prevailed, or you have endured. But really, literally, the Hebrew, humbly I say this, is, and you have become more able. So it's something about, you know, you don't necessarily welcome the struggle, but you become more able through the struggle. And once Jacob becomes known as Israel, then everyone who comes after him are now the children of Israel, whether they're part of that biological family or whether they choose to become part of the Jewish people, which is one of the reasons that Jews are not accurate to describe Jewish people as a race, because you can become Jewish, right? No matter who you are, where you're from, and there are people who do. Back to the Bible with the book of Ruth, for example. So we got Hebrews and we got Israelites. So we're both crossers over in terms of people who journey and are on the move and move from one place to another place. And we have these kind of wrestlers who become more able through engaging and grappling with others, with God, with issues, and so forth. The last thing we end up being known as, which is really toward the end of the Bible, it's not in the Torah per se, but it's in the Bible, in the third part, in the writings, it's in the book of Esther, when we become known as the Jews. Mordecai, if you know the book of Esther, one of the characters is known as Mordecai the Jew. And Jew literally means grateful or gratitude. So that's what Jewish is. And it's interesting, and it really kind of holds a lot of meaning for me as a rabbi, but also as a Jewish person who starts my day out like this. The first words of Jewish prayer in the morning when you wake up, right? Not in the synagogue, although a lot of people do it in the synagogue, but it really is in bed when you wake up, is thanks. And say, thankful am I to you, right? Basically for waking me up to another day. So that's the root of the word Jew and Jewish. So we kind of have, through the Hebrew words, these different perspectives or different dimensions of what the roots of being Jewish are. And by the way, and I know we're going to get into, you guys are going to get into Russian next week. I'll just say this, and the person who's going to present is wonderful. I know her, and it's going to be amazing. So it's really interesting. In Russian, there are two different words for Jewish, in whether you're talking about Jewish, the religion, which we're familiar with from the English, which is Judaism, and in Russian it's Judaism, right? So it sounds pretty similar. But then they have a whole other word that we don't have in English, really, that basically would be translated in English as Jewishness, right? Because that's the part of where one can feel Jewish and be connected Jewishly, and it not having to do with religion. You know, that's what kind of makes it difficult sometimes to compare and contrast Christianity and Judaism, is because the Jewish story kind of goes back to this spiritual journey, but also to this family, right, that opens up to become this people. So you can't really pull apart the religion from the culture, from the ethnicity. It's kind of all intertwined together. And so as a hospital chaplain, when I'm visiting Jewish people in the hospital, that there could be someone who identified as Jewish checking into the hospital who doesn't believe in God, who going to synagogue is not part of their life or what they find meaning in, and really don't connect religiously, and yet feel strongly Jewish, right? Which is kind of a conundrum for some people from the outside to say, well, what's Jewish left? And there's all this other cultural stuff, whether one of its language, music, food, history. So I'm going to pause again because I know we maybe have a few minutes left. So let's see any questions, comments before we finish up.
There was a question in the chat from Ruth. She was asking if you could discuss the relationship between Hebrew, Yiddish, and languages such as Ladino.
Excellent. Thank you, Ruth, for the question. Okay, so I think I want to put it this way, to try to be brief and clear. Both Yiddish and Ladino, I'll start with Yiddish, but they're basically kind of parallels, is an attempt to integrate a language or languages of the diaspora with Hebrew. So, for example, Yiddish is very relevant and very rich and became much more a part of people's lives than Hebrew outside of the synagogue for Jews coming from Eastern European background. So for example, you can have, 75, 80-year-old Russian-speaking Jewish people, right, who are living here now, but they lived in the Soviet Union during the times of communism, when you couldn't go to a synagogue and you couldn't practice religion. By the way, not that it was easy to practice Christianity either, or any religion during that time, but particularly difficult and even dangerous to do Jewish things. And yet they still remember Yiddish from their childhood because somehow in the family that was spoken and they remembered that. So even though they have very little Jewish background, because a lot of people would talk about the cultural genocide with respect to Jewish culture in the Soviet Union, they hang on to that. So it's really a mix of Russian, German, and Hebrew. And they're put together, and it developed very organically over time. It's very fascinating that in the last 20 years, Yiddish has had this revival. And you have many universities, and not because Harvard is the only university, but it's an interesting example that at Harvard, you would have a Yiddish language program and a professor of Yiddish language and literature, and that people would be interested in studying that. Many people would not have seen this kind of renaissance or revival of Yiddish coming. And similarly, for Jewish people who don't have the Eastern European background, but they have what we would call the Spanish or North African background. These are Jews who, different than the path of moving around that their Eastern European brothers and sisters took, and they're known as Ashkenazi Jews. Ashkenaz is actually a word for German, or for Germany, but kind of more connected to that area of Europe and then end up in Eastern Europe. These are Jews who were expelled from Spain and Portugal in 1492, and where they went to. And, you know, typically always there's very fascinating stories to tell, and they play themselves out today in geopolitics. What places were open to taking Jews in then, right? North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, right, for example. So when they make those Jewish communities make their way to Israel, you have even a little bit more of these Spanish background Jews, Sephardic Jews. Sephardic is Spanish background, Ashkenazic, Eastern European background. And so Ladino is kind of the parallel. You know, I'm far from an expert in this, but basically, in a basic way, Ladino is the parallel. And so you kind of have this Judeo-Arabic Spanish language, where you're not going to find German and Russian words, which would be totally unfamiliar in that language, but you're going to find Spanish and Arabic words. And that kind of became a Jewish feeling way of integrating where those Jews were and having their own Jewish kind of take or dialect version and so forth. It's a great question. So with your permission, I'm gonna end this way. First of all, if you're interested in the Hebrew language in terms of the development of the Hebrew language, this book, which is How the Hebrew Language Grew, I don't know, I'm kind of curious, and pardon me for playing around a little bit, but do you guys see that upside down or backwards, or do you see it correctly? Okay, awesome. Okay, so How the Hebrew Language Grew. I wish you find this all over the place on the streets of New York and these used book vendors on the street corners. I wish I would have picked up a lot more of those when I was in graduate school in New York City. But it's definitely findable online. And what's really neat about it is it's written by a Hebrew teacher and not by a linguist or an academician. So it's really, really accessible. Another one is Hebrew in America, because, you know, this ends up being a really big conversation piece here inside the Jewish community is, you know, how much effort do we put forth to teach Jewish people in America Hebrew if everything's available in translation? You know, the argument might be, why spend the time and the effort when we could just do Jewish in English? And between those people and people more like me, who would say you just can't do it all in translation, with all due respect, and the Hebrew is integral. And then one other thing I'll mention, which is the wisdom in the Hebrew alphabet, because, you know, it's a challenge to learn Hebrew like it is to learn any language, but the alphabet itself really becomes an entryway into Hebrew without a goal, for example, to become fluent in Hebrew, though that's laudable, but to become familiar with the Hebrew alphabet and to start to see what connections there are for someone by way of the Hebrew letters. And that is, I think, a way towards ending by saying this. There was a question or a request to read something in Hebrew and English. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to use the book of Psalms. The Hebrew in the book of Psalms, by the way, is beautiful. And a friend and mentor of mine, Rabbi Simcha Weintraub in New York City, kind of does a lot of therapy himself by translating. You know, he'll kind of put out maybe 7 or 8 different English translations of the book of Psalms and look at a particular psalm and kind of come up with his own translation. And you can see when you're looking at multiple translations what the different possibilities of any particular word are. So the book of Psalms, 150 poems. They kind of span the spectrum of human experience, of emotion, from, you know, delight, celebration, to despair and depression, and everywhere in between. And this is Psalm 121. And I'm just going to read the first verse. In English, the verse goes, and probably some of you are familiar with this, I lift my eyes up to the mountains, from where shall my help come? Right? And in Hebrew, it goes like this. Esa einai el heharim me'ayin yavo ezri. I just want to underline for a second the word for mountain. The word for mountains in Hebrew is harim. So just see if you can hear that word. Esa einai el heharim. Right? Unto the mountains. Harim, mountains. So the word for parents in Hebrew is horim. So it's basically the same letters, but different vocalization, if it's ha or ho, right? So that leads the rabbis in rabbinic interpretation, let's say, commentary on this verse of this psalm, to say you can also understand this verse as saying, I lift my eyes up to my parents. From where shall my help come? You know, and a lot of times in different pastoral care contexts, you can imagine a funeral setting, for example. I'll bring that up sometimes because that slight kind of shift in understanding that verse when the context is family, and particularly a parent and a child with a parent, you can do a lot of that in Hebrew because of the similarity of different words and their roots. So we're good. Next session we do all in Hebrew. Well, thank you guys. I mean, anyone, I'm good for any more questions or comments if anyone has them.
Very, very interesting. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah.
We are going to end the program from here. So thank you guys for joining us tonight for our presentation of Lexicon. We appreciate everybody's attendance, and we hope everybody enjoyed the program as much as we did. And we would also like to extend a very big thank you to Rabbi Rednick for providing us with his time and talents this evening. And if you enjoyed tonight's program and would like to support future IRC programming, we encourage you to join as a member, make a donation, or download the IRC app. Again, all of these links are available in the chat function. So thank you again for coming, and have a wonderful rest of your night.
Thank you, everyone. Toda rabah.